Hello, everyone. I am Asadullah Khan Wazir. I hope you all are doing great. Today, we will delve into some of the pressing geopolitical and economic challenges shaping our world today. I am honored to be joined by renowned Professor Warwick Powell. Professor Powell is a leading voice in the fields of international political economy, geopolitics, and system change. He currently serves as the chairman of Smart Trade Networks and holds the position of adjunct professor at Queensland University of Technology. Professor Paul, senior fellow at the Taihai University Institute in Beijing. Professor Paul is a curator and alliance member for multipolar peace. He is also the author of China, Trust and Digital Supply Chains, a work that speaks directly to the dynamics of trust in a rapidly changing world. Professor, thank you so much for your time. It's a pleasure having you. How are you doing?
I'm very well, thank you. It's a pleasure to be with you.
Thank you. Professor, let's start our discussion with the recent Iran-Israel war. The recent Israel-Iran war that brought the world dangerously close to a prolonged regional conflict. But fortunately, it ended after 12 chaotic days. The crisis clearly tested the effectiveness of international diplomacy. So, from your perspective, how effective were international bodies and major powers in de-escalating the situation? And what do you think? What lessons can be learned for the future crises?
Look, I think the first thing to bear in mind is that this particular 12 days or so of active missile exchanges between Israel and Iran is part and parcel of a multi-decades conflict in the region that remains unresolved. Let's also not forget that this is taking place against the backdrop of the persistent and egregious attacks on civilians in Gaza by Israel, to a point where many international observers believe that the actions are tantamount to genocide. So the regional situation has been a festering, boiling pot of tensions for a long time. The fact that this particular exchange between Israel and Iran ended in 12 days speaks less to the strength of multilateral institutions and their capacity to deliver diplomatic-based outcomes, and more to some fundamental realities that became evident during the course of this fortnight or so. It's important to understand the nature of this particular episode. As your viewers will recall, this episode began when Israel launched an unprovoked attack on Iran. It did so ostensibly in the name of addressing this question of Iran's nuclear program, but I think the evidence is becoming increasingly clear that the core objectives of this particular intervention was to seek to change the government in Tehran. The Israelis had planned an attack for a long time, and an opportunity emerged, according to their own calculus, to take action, believing that there was a high probability of success, meaning a change of government. That failed. And as the days went on after the initial attack, what initially appeared to be weakness from the Iranian side progressively transformed into an understanding that, in fact, Iran, firstly at a societal level, seemed to become more consolidated around the government rather than the reverse. And secondly, at a military level, it was more than a match for Israel. the attacks that were launched back at Israel were ultimately able to penetrate the Israeli air defense systems and showed those air defense systems up for their limitations. What we also learned is that the Israeli hardware was beginning to deplete substantially, and there were growing concerns that should this conflict continue for much longer, another 2 weeks or so, then Israel itself would begin to run dangerously short of air defense capabilities. The United States was dragged into this particular conflict at this moment in time, in large part out of concerns that Israel was on the edge of faltering. And you'll recall that when the Israelis first launched the attack, the United States initially denied any knowledge of it and claimed that they had nothing to do with it. Of course, that denial that came from the State Department and the Secretary of State, Rubio, was actually very quickly undermined by comments made by President Trump, which I think made it quite clear that, in fact, the Israelis and the United States had been in close contact and had liaised and planned this intervention for quite some time. The final intervention, or the most recent intervention by the Americans, and then the orchestrated response from Iran to the American bombings of the nuclear facilities, in a sense, was an intervention from the Americans that was necessary to draw this particular episode to a head and to bring an end to this episode. In that regard, it successfully achieved that objective. What it didn't do, though, was ultimately achieve the stated objective, which was to end Iran's nuclear program. And of course, it did not successfully achieve a change of government in Tehran. On balance, it's probably fair to say that you would be happier if you were in Tehran than you would be in Tel Aviv, and certainly in Washington, despite all of the rhetoric. So international institutions probably played a relatively minimal role in bringing this episode to an end. Arguably, the only international institution that has been intimately involved in this process, which is the International Atomic Energy Agency, played not a constructive role at all. There are reports in Iran, true or not, I don't know, of course, but that there are reports that the IAEA actively provided intelligence to the collective West and to Israel in relation to the location of Iran's facilities and particular resources, as well as its key scientists and personnel involved in the nuclear program. And we've now seen, of course, the Iranian parliament pass new laws that, in effect, see Iran withdraw its collaboration with the IAEA and mandates any future collaboration or coordination with the IAEA with some very, very strict conditions. So that's where I think we're at the moment. International institutions did not play a substantial part directly, and I'm thinking of organisations like the UN. The IAEA has had its credibility severely damaged, and perhaps to a point where it is on life support at the moment. And in terms of regional balance of power, it is clear that Iran, and notwithstanding the damage that it took, has come out in a much stronger position than previously anticipated.
Okay, so Professor, you have rightly pointed out the ineffectiveness of international institutions. So my question is, how do you analyze both the immediate and long-term implications for the global political system, or when we talk about particularly the Middle East?
Look, unfortunately, many of the root causes that underpin this particular episode, and I call it an episode because I think that this is a conflict that extends far beyond this past 2 weeks. The root causes remain unresolved. And those root causes go to the question of Israel and the question of Palestine. And until that particular question is ultimately resolved in a way that delivers a stable set of security institutions that satisfy all the parties involved, then I'm afraid the region will continue to exist in a state of instability. The some of the long-standing disputes, of course, have been mediated successfully, and I think particularly of those between the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia and Iran itself, as well as the long-standing factional disputes amongst the Palestinian organisations themselves. But they are only part of what is clearly a very complex and historically grounded series of disputes, many of which, I might add, are amplified by the role of Western imperial nations, originally the British, and of course more recently the United States. And because of that, it is going to be still very difficult for the region to ultimately arrive at a settlement that delivers the security ambitions that every particular nation in the region looks to. And so, for the time being, we are left with a situation in which the nations themselves are addressing the issues less at a strategic level and far more at a tactical level, in a sense, to just get by and try to get through another month and another month and another month without necessarily breaking out into further conflict. So, from a long-term point of view, there is a long, long way to go before we are able to close off this chapter of Middle Eastern instability.
Okay, so Professor, just for your information, Donald Trump again signaled out that U.S. might again attack Iran. So when we look at this war, it was also a war of narrative. You have pointed out that Israel had two objectives: to destroy Iranian nuclear program and also to change the regime, but it didn't happen. So when we look at the war of narrative, the Western media and the Western world propagated that the notion that Israel is undefeatable and its defensive system impenetrable. However, Iran's missile strikes targeted key military sites in Tel Aviv and other strategic locations, signaling Israel's vulnerabilities. So, do you believe that this has ended the myth of Israel's regional hegemony?
Absolutely. I think that this attempt at a change of government in Tehran was fundamentally part of the Israeli American efforts to secure Israeli and American hegemony in the region, and it has failed. That's not to say that the Americans and the Israelis won't seek to further destabilize the region in the hopes of being able to have another attempt at some time in the future. This particular objective has been long-standing. And I think that there's also a broader context as well, because when you look at the geography of the region as a whole and you start to link together the landforms from, say, Egypt, which is at the sort of northeasterly most point of the African continent, and then work your way eastward from there, ultimately to Afghanistan, you actually have a formidable territorial space that, in many regards, creates a continental bridge between Central and East Asia on the one hand, and West Asia and North Africa on the other. And it is economically and security-wise significant. In security terms, of course, it's an important location in relation to access to the ocean, as well as providing space that can enable the major powers in the region to have defensive room to move. But economically, it's significant too, because it not only has abundant natural resources in its own right, but it's also a critical zone of connectivity that opens up a whole two continents in effect, North Africa through West Asia and into Eurasia proper. So at a much broader level, there have been long-standing Western concerns that Eurasia itself will begin to firstly consolidate and stabilize, and ultimately through that become an impenetrable economic block, if you will, that is impervious to Western manipulation and Western containment. And that's certainly not something that's been in the interests of the collective West, going all the way back to the British. So I think that when we start to understand why this part of the world has been such a focal point of collective Western interest, and why it has found it so difficult to find stability and security, I think we can start to see some of the main underlying reasons for that. And again, because of these factors, the ability of this region to ultimately arrive at a settlement that delivers the stability and security that people in the region aspire to achieve is going to remain a very difficult task.
Okay. So, Professor, I was reading one of your essays titled The Washington Consensus Has Failed, where you suggested a breakdown in traditional global governance system, but keeping in mind the recent Iran-Israel conflict, similarly Gaza and Ukraine war, don't you believe that the recent Iran-Israel war further highlighted the limitations of existing international frameworks and the urgent need for an inclusive, democratic, and new global approaches?
Look, quite clearly, for the best part of the last 35 years, the dominant set of arrangements, both economically, financially, institutionally, and ultimately backed militarily, has not delivered for many people across the globe. The Washington Consensus, which is an economic ideology, if you will, that promised economic development and prosperity for developing countries if they only liberalised markets, dismantled the public sector, privatised public assets, pursued fiscal discipline in line with the demands of the International Monetary Fund. That particular ideological framework for economic development has not delivered. And we see that in a whole range of evidence that touches on the real living standards of many people in the developing world not improving at all. We also see evidence of the persistent and significant distributional inequalities amongst nations, where central nations, particularly of the traditional transatlantic colonial West, have benefited from the raw materials and the ability to extract wealth from peripheral nations. And of course, we see the indebtedness that has been imposed on many developing nations over the course of the last 3 to 4 decades that simply has not delivered the economic development that was promised by these Bretton Woods and post-Bretton Woods institutions. So in economic development terms, the Washington Consensus did not deliver on its promise. In terms of security, as we've been discussing, quite clearly there are many parts of the world that remain unsecure, and that there persist a whole range of significant sources of conflict that prevailing institutions and the prevailing powers have also not succeeded in resolving. In some of these, it's probably fair to say that the principal cause for why many of these conflicts persist is actually the ongoing efforts by Western powers to create instability and to ferment discontent within regions and amongst people in regions themselves. It's part of a divide and conquer mentality that ensures that certain regions of the world remain suppressed and enables the prevailing global powers to have their own co-opted allies within these regions that, in a sense, can advocate for the interests of the collective West. That's all coming to an end, though. It's coming to an end in part because China has been able to punch through the defensive constraints of the system as a whole for the collective West to suppress China. And as China has punched through, it has also reached out to the broader global South to begin a long process of economic development through infrastructure, education capacity, and ultimately through trade and investment flows. Russia's re-emergence too has been critical in this process. 30 years ago, or 34 years ago, when the Soviet Union was dismantled, there was a view at the time that the West and the Western model had won the battle for history, and that there would be one way of moving forward. In the subsequent decade or so, Russia itself went through significant challenges. And whilst it remained, of course, an important nuclear power, at an economic level, Russia really receded substantially from the days of the Soviet Union. But over the course of the last 2 decades, it is clear that Russia has turned its situation around, and it has now demonstrated to the world that it is today far more than a gas station masquerading as a country. It is, in fact, a nation with a sophisticated population and an economic base that continues to defy the Western caricatures, and which demonstrates a level of industrial complexity and scale capability that many in the West had underestimated and did not foresee. And so we are now in a phase of global transformation where the old order that had dominated the world for 3 or more decades has begun to crumble, and crumble quite badly. Unfortunately, many of the unresolved contradictions in different parts of the world are now coming to the fore, because as the prevailing dominant regime, global regime, begins to corrode, the weakest points within that overall regime begin to fester. And as the dominant powers seek to cling on to what they've got and turn the tide back, They, of course, ultimately instigate or catalyze the outbreak of conflict in some of these hotspots.
So, Professor, as you said that the Western world, or to say the US, wants instability in different regions. So, a brief answer from your side. Do you think so that the US is pursuing foreign policy of war and belligerence?
Look, again, let's put this into a little bit of historical context so that we're not just talking about America in the abstract. The United States has, for the best part of its entire history, been at war. No more than about a dozen years of its existence have been without war. A recent study conducted by some American academics and published in a book called Dying by the Sword goes through statistical evidence of American military interventions around the world and concludes that, and I quote, America is a nation that is addicted to military intervention. The puts forward is stark as well. Between 1946 and 1990, which was the period of the so-called Cold War, the United States initiated on average 2.4 new military interventions per year. After the end of the Cold War, so between 1991 and 2019, the number of interventions on average each year actually increased to 3.7. So, despite the fact that the United States was ostensibly in a position of dominance, unilateral dominance, unquestioned dominance, its military intervention activities actually increased in number and also in intensity. So the United States foreign policy has been militarized and has been militarized for a long time. So much so that it is probably fair to say that the military response, the kinetic first response, is actually the ingrained habitual response to any circumstance in which the United States finds itself in. It has certainly lost the ability to conduct sophisticated diplomatic statecraft, and that spells risk to the world as the United States enters into a period of significant displacement from a position of unquestioned unilateral dominance to one in which it needs to find a place in the context of an emerging multipolar world. So, American foreign policy has been inherently kinetic and violent. The risk we now face, therefore, is that its instincts will also be kinetic first and violent. The difference is that the material environment has changed somewhat. In times past, particularly in the post-Cold War era, there was no peer that could match the United States. And so the United States was able to pursue its ambitions in effect unfettered. However, it is now clear that its military capabilities are actually nowhere near as powerful as perhaps many thought, certainly in relative terms, as other powers have modernized and expanded their own military capabilities. And the United States is actually changing the way that it militarizes its foreign policy with less of its own commitments and more of the commitments of its allies. So the United States is building a network of power projection that is far more multi-layered today than perhaps it once was. So instead of there being a hubs and spokes network, the United States is building a network of minilateral or multilateral allies, and then badgering those allies to increase their own military commitments and ultimately to take the front row seat We've seen that in Europe, and we're starting to see that also in the Western Pacific or in the East and Southeast Asian arena.
Professor, we are running short of time. There are so many questions to be asked from you, but my bad, we have a very short of time. So let me ask you this question, and I would request you to please be brief. Giving your extensive work on China and Chinese economy, and recently in your essay, Oil Shock 2.0, you argue that China is better positioned to absorb global energy shocks even in the event of a Strait of Hormuz closure. So, what do you think? What internal strength have allowed China to maintain this resilience, and what has enabled China to continue growing economically despite Western efforts at decoupling?
Look, the fundamental foundations of this is China's ability to develop its own energy autonomy or its own energy sovereignty. Of course, any oil shock will affect countries around the world, and China is not immune to that. A substantial part of the Chinese economic system continues to rely upon crude oil imports and crude oil-based energy products. But over the course of the last 10 to 15 years, the structural transformation that has been taking place in China has seen China's economic dependency on crude oil as an energy source decline in relative terms. And that is the fundamental change that has taken place. So China is progressively and day by day increasing its capacity to be an energy sovereign nation. And it's doing that through electrification. Electrification enables China to drive greater efficiencies in its economic system overall, because it is able to ultimately achieve energy transformation activities at a much higher rate of energy return on energy invested. But importantly, especially in today's geopolitically fraught environment, it is able to do that by enhancing its own economic sovereignty and independence. So energy independence and sovereignty has been central to China's economic development story, and also central to its ability to withstand some of these external shocks that we are now, on the edge of experiencing and facing.
Okay, Professor, let me ask you a last question. You have written extensively on multipolarity. So, my question is, are we in a transitional phase, or have we already entered a multipolar world?
I think a little bit of both is the answer, meaning that we are no longer in a unipolar world. So in that regard, by definition, we are already in a multipolar world. The reason why I also say we are in transition is because we haven't yet settled at what that multipolar institutional arrangements and balance of power ultimately looks like, and how that pans out in terms of the way that states frame the world and ultimately manage their own behaviours and conduct. So we are no longer in a unipolar world. That is well and truly behind us. Arguably, that transition happened sometime in certainly a decade ago, maybe a little bit less, but the precise date is probably not that important. The point is that the United States is no longer in a position to dictate terms globally in a unilateral way, and ultimately will be forced to adjust its own behaviours to be more consistent with the requirements of a multipolar environment. Now, the way that the US is doing that at the moment is largely underpinned by a sense of great power rivalry. So the United States, I think, sees multipolarity through the lenses of great powers and through the lens of regional spheres of influence. I'm not convinced that the other major powers in the world, whether they be Russia, China, and the other BRICS nations, necessarily buys that characterization, but certainly the United States at the moment is proceeding on that basis. In doing so, what it's trying to do is consolidate its position in the Western Hemisphere. It is seeking to cajole its European allies to do more heavy lifting and continue to pursue the long-term American ambitions to destabilize Russia and ultimately drive regime change there and perhaps even to break Russia up, whilst America pivots more substantially to the Asia region. The situation in the Middle East is a significant distraction for the Americans, but they have no choice. They are welded at the hip to Israel, and there is very little that any American administration can do to disentangle itself from the problems of that region. So we are already in a multipolar world, but it is a multipolar world that is characterized by significant fluidity and flux.
Professor Paul, thank you so much. It was pleasure having you. We have learned so much from you, and we would love to hear more from you in the future. Thank you so much for your time.
Absolute pleasure to be with you, and I'd love to come back.
Thank you so much, Professor.